Week 8 of the 2024 fantasy football season is in the books, and we're headed straight into Week 9 of the 2024 fantasy football season. So many wide receivers to choose from. We've got 2 NFL bye weeks this week. We've got more injuries, plenty of excitement, plenty of disappointment. We are halfway through the fantasy football season, so you know exactly what we need to do. We need to break down every single wide receiver for every single matchup in Week 9 and go over who you should be starting and who you should be sitting. And before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their Week 9 NFL Pick'ems are already going live, and Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Thursday night football. Or if you guys watch this after Thursday night football, a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Sunday's slate of games. And on top of that, Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free pick'em for Week 9, as well as up to $1,000 in bonus cash when you sign up with promo code THECATCH. Very quickly, we have 2 teams on bye weeks here in Week 9. The San Francisco 49ers, so no Deebo Samuel, Ricky Pearsall, Jawan Jennings, whoever is going to be healthy for the Niners potentially, and then no George Pickens or I guess Van Jefferson or Calvin Austin. So make sure you guys are checking your lineups and making adjustments accordingly. Let's start the video with Thursday night football. We will have the Texans traveling to face the Jets. So let's start with the fact that Stephon Diggs did suffer an injury in Week 8 against the Indianapolis Colts. So at the time I'm recording this, it's early on Monday. We don't know exactly what's going to go on with Diggs for the week, but he is undergoing an MRI testing on that knee. It's a non-contact injury, usually not a good scenario, but until we have an actual report here, don't exactly know what to do with Stephon Diggs. Of course, if Stephon Diggs plays, he is always a startable player, so we have him in the start category. But by the time this video comes out, Stephon Diggs might be officially ruled out for Week 9. So if you own Diggs, he's healthy, you start him. If you own Diggs and he's not healthy, then obviously we're not starting him. It is a tough matchup regardless against the Jets, but still starting a player like Stephon Diggs, who's top 12 at the wide receiver position thus far on this season. Then we got Tank Dell, who I think is a good start no matter what. A little bit elevated in terms of a starter this week if Diggs is out, and Tank Dell has to fill in as the wide receiver 1. As we know, Nico Collins is still going to be on IR through Week 9. So Tank Dell, 13.5 fantasy points in Week 8 against the Colts. 4 targets, 4 receptions, 35 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Bounce back in nice fashion from that Week 7 goose egg. So, yeah, it's a tough matchup against Sauce Gardner and company, as the Jets are giving up the 8th fewest fantasy points to the wide receiver position thus far on the season. But this is a good spot for Tank Dell. I think he's a good start, good flex play for you guys this week. Outside of that, I'm just not confident in starting any other receiver on this team. We saw 2 targets, for Robert Woods in Week 8. 3.8 fantasy points. Xavier Hutchinson, 1 target, 2.9 fantasy points. We did get a little bit of involvement out of John Mechie, at least in comparison to everybody else here, with 4 targets, 3 receptions, 29 receiving yards, and 5.9 fantasy points. There's going to be some opportunity here, but my guess is that the Texans are going to run the football first and foremost with Joe Mixon, and then try and get a player like Tank Dell to step up here. So I'm going to stay away from any other Texans wide receivers here on the week. Moving along to the Jets. Since the Jets have acquired Davante Adams, we've had some collective panic around Garrett Wilson. And as soon as that trade happened, I told you guys, do not worry about Garrett Wilson. If anything, this is a good thing for Garrett Wilson. Less defensive pressure. He's been just fine. 13.1 fantasy points in Week 7, 16.3 in Week 8. In that loss to the New England Patriots, 8 targets, 5 receptions, 113 receiving yards. He's a top 10 fantasy football wide receiver. You continue to start Garrett Wilson on a weekly basis. This is a good matchup as the Texans are giving up the 24th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. Then we got Davante Adams, 9.4 fantasy points in Week 8, 6 targets, 4 receptions, 54 receiving yards. after having just 6 fantasy points in week 7 against the Steelers in his first game with the Jets. So I don't know. I mean, this Jets team is definitely in a state of disarray, but I think Adams is still flexible since it's a good matchup. The Jets are going to have to do whatever they can. They have to win this game. I mean, I think they can suffer like one more loss and still be at a place where they could fight for a wild card spot if they win out at that point. So this is a huge game for the Jets. They got to do whatever they can to win this matchup. I would like to think that Adams will get more involved here, have more fantasy value, but until we see it, he is no more than a flex. And I'll say he's a risky flex at that. Then we got Allen Lazard, who was out with that chest injury in week 8. I'm just going to sit him for now. The volume wasn't great in week 7 with Adams there. I want to like Lazard. I still think he's going to have moments in the season, but he's just not startable right now. Mike Williams, nothing in week 8. Nothing. 0 fantasy points, 0 targets. Let's just avoid everybody except for Garrett Wilson and I guess a little sprinkle of Devontae Adams as we approach week 9. And honestly, I love Garrett Wilson's total receiving line right now on Underdog. It's sitting at 63.5 receiving yards. He has hit that in 3 out of the last 4 games. And the only game he didn't hit that, which was week 7 against Pittsburgh, he only missed it by 4 total yards. So I would head straight to Underdog, hit the over on Garrett Wilson's receiving yard line. And don't forget, all new users who sign up with promo code DCatch are getting a free NFL Pick'em for the week. Take your free Pick'em, pair it with Garrett Wilson on the over for his receiving yards. And once that hits, you're going to automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code DCatch a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. Moving along to Sunday, let's start with the Saints traveling to face the Panthers. And Chris Olave coming off of the concussion in week 7. I was a little worried with Spencer Rattler, quarterback, going up against the Chargers, but we also saw a little sprinkle of Jake Haener in week 8, and there is a chance, potentially, that we see Derek Carr start for the Saints at quarterback in week 9. So that would be a good thing for Chris Olave, right? But regardless, getting back to the point, Chris Olave was fine in week 8. 14 targets, 8 receptions, 107 receiving yards against the Chargers, 18.7 fantasy points. So I'm going to say really regardless of the quarterback situation against the Panthers, we're going to go ahead and start Chris Olave. He should be a solid start. Maybe the quarterback situation limits his ceiling, but 18 fantasy points against the Chargers. We should feel pretty good about Olave this week against the Panthers. In terms of anyone else, Bub Means had 1 catch and 4.6 fantasy points last week, and he suffered a high ankle sprain, so he's going to be a sit for me. Then we got Mason Tipton up next. He had 2 targets, 2 catches, 3.4 fantasy points. Just no thank you. I mean, of course, against a team like the Panthers, there's obviously some opportunity here, but let's just start Chris Olave, sit everybody else. Moving along to the Panthers. Interesting situation here as Deontay Johnson missed this past week, and maybe by the time this video comes out, Deontay Johnson has been traded. I don't know. Maybe he's still on the team. We'll just have to wait and see here. The rumor is that he is expected to be traded by the trade deadline, so he's probably going to keep nursing an injury if he's still on this team. So if he starts for the Panthers, then sure, you can fire him up this week, but the trend is not looking that way. So that leaves Xavier Leggett as the wide receiver 1 on this team. I think he's startable in this matchup. Looks like Andy Dalton should be back in week 9. Bryce Young was, I think, better than we at least expected in week 8. So I think Xavier Leggett's startable in the flex. I still think there's risk. You look at the pattern here since week 4, 19.6 fantasy points, a touchdown. 1.8, no touchdown. 11.3, a touchdown. 2.9, no touchdown. Last week, 13.4 fantasy points and a touchdown. So in games where he has scored a touchdown since week 4, he's had double digits. In games where he has not scored a touchdown, he's not hit double digits. So there's risk here, but I like the matchup enough against the Saints. I don't really trust this defense. So garbage time, all that stuff. Xavier Leggett could see an opportunity in this game where he's at least flexible with some risk. And then in terms of anybody else on this roster, just no thank you. I mean, Jalen Coker did some stuff last week and had the garbage time touchdown, 6 targets, 4 receptions, a touchdown, 78 receiving yards, 17.8 fantasy points. Definitely a name to keep an eye on, but for the most part, I'm just going to stay away from the Panthers wide receivers and only treating the number 1 wide receiver on this team as a flex option approaching week 9. Moving along, we got the Commanders traveling to face the Giants, and I will admit I was a little worried about Terry McLaurin last week. Tough matchup against the Bears. Jalen Johnson. Didn't know if Jaden Daniels was going to play. I will say I was more worried in a scenario where Marcus Mariota got the start, but obviously Jaden Daniels played. Terry McLaurin was fine. Good overall day for the Commanders, getting that win in crazy fashion. That's my team. Anyways, 8 targets, 5 receptions, 125 receiving yards, 17.5 fantasy points for Scary Terry, a top 10 fantasy football wide receiver. Don't care about the matchup. Don't care who he's playing. As long as Jaden Daniels is healthy, we're rolling Terry McLaurin out on a weekly basis. I'm keeping that faith in Terry McLaurin. I know I got a little bit scared last week, but his line on Underdog is sitting at 64.5 receiving yards. He has hit that in 3 of the last 4 matchups and in 4 of the last 6 matchups. He is the true wide receiver 1 on this team. Love him this week against the Giants. I think he'll smash this line, so head straight to Underdog. Take the over on Terry McLaurin's total receiving yard total, and don't forget, all new users who sign up with promo code The Catch are going to get that free NFL Pick'em for the week. Take your free Pick'em. Take this line for Terry McLaurin's total receiving yards. Once it hits, you're going to automatically triple your cash entry. And while you're doing that, Underdog is also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 when you sign up with promo code The Catch. In terms of anybody else, Noah Brown had the Hail Mary catch, which resulted in 16.3 fantasy points, but outside of that, he has not hit double-digit fantasy points or scored a touchdown once on the season. So shout out to Noah Brown for making the catch that won this game, but we're still not considering him from a fantasy perspective. And you got Zacchaeus, who had the touchdown call back and ended up with 0 fantasy points. You've got Dewami Brown, who had 1.6 fantasy points, and you got Mini CMC, who had 1.8 fantasy points. Just the way this offense rolls, it's Terry McLaurin, and it's nobody else at this point in time from a fantasy perspective. Now, as a reminder, I have to record these early on Monday in order to get these videos out for you guys. So I don't know how the Giants have looked tonight against the Steelers. It is a tough matchup, but really, regardless, I'm going to continue to start Malik Neighbors on a weekly basis for now. I'm not going to be too spooked about the bad performance in week 7. It was a bad overall performance for the offense. If he has a lower ceiling game against Pittsburgh, I'm still not going to be scared. It's a good matchup against the Commanders in week 9, although that defense has looked better than a good matchup for Malik Neighbors again in week 10 with the Panthers. So I'm going to continue to keep the faith in Neighbors and start him. Then we got Rondell Robinson, who I think is a good flex play on a weekly basis. I know the ceiling has been a little bit lower as of late. Maybe he has a lower ceiling against the Steelers. Maybe he doesn't. Still think he is a flexible player in this matchup. The last time the Giants and Commanders met this year, Malik Neighbors had 28.7 fantasy points and Robinson had 9.8 fantasy points, but did score a touchdown. So they're definitely both startable in this matchup. Then we got Darius Slayton, 2.1 fantasy points. He's really come back to earth with Malik Neighbors being healthy, so he is a sit as we move into the week. Moving along, we got the Dolphins traveling to face the Bills. A lot of names to go over here. Let's start with the Dolphins wide receivers, who I expected a little bit more out of in week 8 in a good matchup against the Cardinals. The game script was good. Tua was back. All of that stuff. And at least Tyreek Hill was startable in this matchup, but he walked away with just 13.2 fantasy points. It is what it is, but I still think that Tyreek Hill is startable moving forward. The Dolphins look like they will provide for good game scripts, and the Bills kind of look the same way, but at the same time, we reversed to last week. The Bills were really stout against the Seahawks when I was expecting a good game script there, and the Dolphins ultimately on the season have had a great pass defense, but against the Cardinals, they did not have a great pass defense. So there's a little bit of a tough, team overall to take a look at right now. But for the most part, even though it is a tough matchup against the Bills, I still think Tyreek Hill is a good start this week. probably a lock for double-digit fantasy points as long as Tua is healthy, and I still think he belongs in starting lineups. But I was disappointed to see Jalen Waddle walk away with just 8.5 fantasy points, 6 targets, 4 receptions, 45 receiving yards. I still think he's flexible this week. I think we're going to get a good game script here. Hopefully it's much better than what we got in week 2 again, or the last time these two teams met. But overall, Waddle in that flex area, but I will say I think he's a risky flex. It depends on what other options you have. Moving along to the Bills. Okay. And this is a tough one here. I think we're going to get a lot of volatility out of this wide receiver room moving forward. The addition of Amari Cooper to this offense has just opened up this offense completely. I mean, the middle of the field is now really difficult to defend because that defensive pressure is consistently looking at Amari Cooper, and that is allowing for big plays from Dalton Kincaid at the tight end position. It's opening up the run game even more with James Cook, and it is also opening up things for Khalil Shakir and then Keon Coleman on the opposite side of Amari Cooper. So all of these players really should probably be in the start category, but I want to put them more as like a flex play because I think we're going to get volatility out of Cooper, Shakir, and Coleman, but they're all good starts on a weekly basis. And this is, on paper, a tough matchup against the Dolphins. Like I said, this has been the best pass defense in the NFL, at least through the first 7 weeks of the season. They bent last week against Kyler Murray and Marvin Harrison Jr. and Michael Wilson, which is a little surprising to see. But nonetheless, Cooper, who walked away with 1.3 fantasy points in week 8, I still think will be okay. I mean, this is part of the Amari Cooper experience, right? I mean, I know this season's been really rough, and there's times where you're like, why am I even starting this guy? But I do think he'll see better days. I still think he's definitely startable, but yeah, maybe down in that flex area due to the volatility. And I've really liked Khalil Shakir all season long and have really considered him a startable player every single week. I think the only week we had him as a sit so far was against the Jets because he was coming off injury, and then he got, the Sauce Gardner treatment. He had a bad game that week, but overall, outside of week 6, he's giving you double digits every single week. His best fantasy day of the season in week 8, 19.9 fantasy points, 107 receiving yards off of 9 catches. Khalil Shakir is a very solid flex. The ceiling might not always be super high, but the floor is super safe. Then we got Keon Coleman. I mean, this chemistry between Josh Allen and Keon Coleman continuing to build momentum. 7 targets, 5 catches, 70 receiving yards, a touchdown, 18 fantasy points, almost had a second touchdown in this game. Absolutely torched Seattle's defense, and he had a great game in week 7 with 16.5 fantasy points as well. So you own Coleman, keep firing him up in the flex. These 3 wide receivers are going to be fantasy studs for the rest of the season. Like I said, maybe some volatility. Now, Curtis Samuel and Mac Hollins have just become the odd men out here. Mac Hollins, 0 targets in week 8, coming off a shoulder injury. So it's Cooper, Shakir, Coleman that we want to start. And hopefully we get some more life out of the Dolphins wide receivers here in week 9. And next up, we have the Chargers traveling to face the Browns. And last week, told you guys Ladd McConkey was the only Chargers wide receiver that I would consider starting. And in week 7, he was also the only Chargers wide receiver I would consider starting. And maybe we got a breakout game in week 8 for Ladd McConkey, 29.1 fantasy points, 6 targets, 6 receptions, 111 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns, 18.5 yards per catch. He had 17.7 fantasy points in week 4, though, 14.9 fantasy points in week 1. Like, we've seen these flashes already, and games where Ladd McConkey has scored a touchdown on the season, he has double-digit fantasy points. So this is a big game, don't get me wrong, but I don't want to kind of overreact here, but I really, for the most part, just hope that the Chargers find a way to consistently throw the football and in the red zone have a connection between Justin Herbert and any wide receiver. We also saw Justin Herbert's first game this year over 14.7 fantasy points with 24 fantasy points. So they did throw the ball effectively in week 7 against the Cardinals, but then did nothing in the red zone. So from a fantasy perspective for these wide receivers, we want to see this pass game get going and see more of what we saw in week 8. And this is a great matchup on the road against the Browns. So Ladd McConkey, definitely a solid start this week, but temper your expectations. I don't think he's quite going to have over 20 fantasy points. Josh Palmer had 9.2 fantasy points in week 8, 4 targets, 2 catches, 72 receiving yards. Not quite ready to start him, but if you're desperate, he's probably an okay flex sitting at 19% rostered. But keep in mind, Quentin Johnson was out with that ankle injury, or has been out with that ankle injury for the past 2 weeks. So if he comes back, some of that volume could be taken away from Josh Palmer. But for the most part, I'm just looking at Ladd McConkey. He's the only guy in terms of Chargers wide receivers that I want to start right now. All right, then we got a big question mark here with the Browns wide receivers. Okay, we liked Cedric Tillman going into week 8 after his breakout performance in week 7, and he had 28.9 fantasy points against the Ravens, who are giving up the most fantasy points to the wide receiver position, worth noting. 9 targets, 7 catches, 99 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. So I'm going to say that Cedric Tillman continues to be a solid start. Now, this is a tough matchup against the Chargers. They've been top 10 against the wide receiver position all season long, but I'm going to keep the faith here in Jameis Winston and company, and I'm going to flex Cedric Tillman this week, but understand, there is volatility with Tillman, Judy, and Elijah Moore, who, based on last week, and quite frankly, the week before, it's not just this week against the awful Ravens secondaries, they were all pretty decent except for Judy against Cincinnati as well. So the pattern's been consistent enough, but keep in mind that whenever we have a backup quarterback situation, things can change very drastically, and this is a tougher matchup against the Chargers this week. I mean, look at Andy Dalton when he came out, guns blazing, and then quickly came back to earth in the following 2 weeks. So still like these guys, but Tillman, Judy, Elijah Moore, who all had double-digit fantasy performances in week 9, do hold some risk and some volatility. If there's one guy I'm going to take a chance on, I'm going to stick with Cedric Tillman. That was my thesis in week 8, but Elijah Moore, 16.5 fantasy points in week 8, Jerry Jeudy, 12.9 in week 8. So they also have some flex appeal moving into the week. And along, we got the Patriots, who are going to travel to face the Titans in what is probably going to be a gross matchup, and I'm just sitting all the Patriots wide receivers. We started to have some belief here in this team and their passing attack, but Drake May went down with a concussion in week 8, and my assumption is that Drake May is not going to play in week 9. If he does, then we could look at flexing Demario Douglas, I guess, but it's like, at this point, I just am staying away from this offense. Jacoby Brissett's probably going to get the start. Demario Douglas, 3.2 fantasy points in week 8. Just no thank you. Kayshon Boutte, 7.6 fantasy points in week 8. KJ Osborne in week 8 had 1 target. So it's like there's just nothing here from a fantasy perspective that interests me. Jalen Polk missed week 8. I'm just staying away, especially if Jacoby Brissett is the starting quarterback. If Drake May is the starting quarterback, you got to be really desperate, but maybe you could start one of those names. Anyways, let's talk about Calvin Ridley, who I did not like going into week 8. Did not feel good about this Titans passing attack with Mason Rudolph at the helm, and Rudolph was 22 of 38, threw 266 passing yards and a touchdown. And Calvin Ridley, 15 targets, 10 catches, 143 receiving yards, 22.6 fantasy points in his first game with no DeAndre Hopkins on this team. So, yeah, sure, I'll put Ridley in the flex category, mainly because it's a good matchup, and I think he can build on that momentum that he had last week. But Ridley had 24.7 fantasy points in week 2. And then in the following 4 games, as the Titans had a bye week in week 5, he had 7.2 or less fantasy points in every matchup, 2.5 or less in 3 of those games. So proceed with caution when it comes to Calvin Ridley, but I think he could be a solid flex against the Patriots for sure. And then in terms of anybody else here, we saw more involvement for Tyler Boyd as well as Nick Westbrook-Ikhine. 6 targets for Boyd in week 8, 4.4 fantasy points. He has not hit double digits on the year so far. I'm staying away. And then Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, on the other hand, does have a touchdown in 3 straight games, but 11.9 fantasy points in week 8 against the Lions was the first time he actually hit double digits. Like, he hasn't had more than 2 catches in the last 3 weeks. So maybe a name to keep an eye on, I guess, but I'm going to stay away from Nick Westbrook-Ikhine as a start this week. So bad matchup overall here for fantasy. Let's just take a look at Calvin Ridley. Everyone else is going to be a sit as we approach week 9. Moving along, we got the Cowboys. Who's going to travel to face the Falcons, and CeeDee Lamb back in the top 5 when it comes to fantasy football wide receivers. There he is. This was the game we were waiting for all season long. 39.6 fantasy points against the Niners, who just decided they were going to stop covering CeeDee Lamb at some point in this game. 17 targets, 13 catches, 146 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns. Let me know if you guys lost a matchup because of CeeDee Lamb. I literally lost a matchup only because I was going up against CeeDee Lamb. Monster fantasy performance. And this week he gets the Atlanta Falcons, which is a good enough matchup. 21st against the wide receiver position. So I think CeeDee Lamb, of course, I mean, we're not even debating this, but yeah, CeeDee Lamb must start on a weekly basis, and this past week proved so. He only has one single digit fantasy performance on the whole season. That was week 3 against the Ravens. So start CeeDee Lamb no matter what. We know this. Okay, Jalen Tolbert, I still think is in that flex area. Low ceiling, bad performance this past week, 7.4 fantasy points, 3 targets, 3 receptions, 44 receiving yards. The game script was there. I don't really understand why they don't get Tolbert more involved when we've seen the flashes so far on the season of what he can do, but I'm expecting a good game script here. The Falcons threw the football a lot last week. They put up a lot of points. The Cowboys just kind of suck, but they're going to find a way to fight back offensively in this game. So I think Tolbert is flexible, but not my favorite flex for the week. He's more of a desperation play. Then we do have Kevontae Turpin, who had 4 targets last week, but just 1 catch, 3.7 fantasy points. It's basically CeeDee Lamb, and that's about the only name that we can really consider a strong start on a weekly basis from the wide receiver position for the Cowboys. Now, we've been looking at Drake London as a strong start on a weekly basis no matter what, but he had just 7.4 fantasy points against the Bucs. Good game script, good matchup, 6 targets, 4 catches, 34 receiving yards. This happens. I mean, it's not always going to be perfect with your wide receiver 1, right? And Drake London's still a top 10 wide receiver so far on the season. He continues to be a start no matter what. The Cowboys 18th against the wide receiver position. Nothing to worry about here. Don't panic. If you own Drake London, keep rolling with him. And really on a weekly basis, Darnell Mooney has just been in that flex category for me. Start him. Roll with the punches. He had 18.6 fantasy points in week 8 against Tampa Bay. Looks like he plays well against Tampa Bay for now, but 6 targets, 4 catches, 86 receiving yards, a tutty. And I like him again this week. I mean, maybe more of a flex play, but go ahead and fire up these Falcons wide receivers. They should be solid starts this week. And then you do have Ray McLeod, who, you know, early in the season had 1 or 2 games where he was looking like a potential flex option, but 5.6 or less fantasy points in his last 3 games, just not going to be an option as we approach week 9. Next up, we have the Raiders traveling to face the Bengals, and this should be an interesting matchup. And man, Jacoby Myers just defies the odds. 13.2 fantasy points in week 5 against Pat Surtain and the Denver Broncos. 17.2 fantasy points coming off an injury in week 8 in a bad matchup against the Kansas City Chiefs as really the only receiving threat at the wide receiver position on this team. I know Brock Bowers is there at tight end, but 7 targets, 6 catches, 52 receiving yards, and a touchdown for Jacoby Myers in week 8. I mean, at this point, if you own Myers, like, sure, maybe he's more of a flex option for you, but he's just a solid start. I mean, you know, you're going to get some low ceiling games here as well, but for the most part, I'm okay just starting Jacoby Myers, and you probably are starting him in the flex. That might depend on your team's injuries, though. Trey Tucker, just 5.3 fantasy points in week 8. DJ Turner did have a touchdown, his first double-digit fantasy performance of the season with 13.2 fantasy points, but I'm going to stay away from DJ Turner. And it's worth noting that Gardner Minshew looked okay in week 8, had the fumble towards the end of the game, but outside of that, no turnovers, threw 2 touchdowns. So we might get some Desmond Ridder this week. I don't know, but ultimately I think that Jacoby Myers will be okay regardless of the quarterback situation. Then we got the Bengals. We're starting Jamar Chase no matter what. 20.4 fantasy points against the Eagles, 11 targets, 9 catches, 54 receiving yards, a touchdown. He is your wide receiver 1 in all of fantasy football. As we move into week 9, start Jamar Chase. Then we got T. Higgins, who did not play this past week. Part of the T. Higgins experience, kept us in suspense for most of the weekend, but did not play with that quad injury. If he's healthy, if he plays, he's a good start this week. It is worth noting that the Raiders have played pretty well against the wide receiver position so far on the season in the top 10, but ultimately, let's not get too spooked here, right? Then as far as anyone else, Andre Uzavis potentially had some opportunity and a good matchup against the Eagles. Good game script. 3 targets, 0 catches, 0 fantasy points. So just no thank you. He has had 0 fantasy points in 2 straight games. I think we're staying away from Yoshi until further notice. And Jermaine Burton did show up in this game. He now has 2 games this season where he has 1 catch for over 40 yards and 5.1 fantasy points in week 8, 5.7 in week 2, 0 in every other game. So we're staying away from Jermaine Burton as we approach week 9. Next up, we got the Broncos who are going to travel to face the Ravens. And Cortland Sutton showed up in big fashion in week 8, 11 targets, 8 catches, 100 receiving yards, 17.1 fantasy points in week 8 after giving you a goose egg in week 7. So let's just continue to start Cortland Sutton in a great matchup against the Baltimore Ravens. Like mentioned earlier, the team giving up the most fantasy points to the wide receiver position thus far on the season. Now, I thought Troy Franklin was a good sneaky start, a good flex option in week 8 against the Panthers. And I mean, the thesis was kind of true. I mean, the Broncos had their way with the Panthers all day long. Bo Nix had his best game of the whole season. And Troy Franklin and Javonte Williams were the 2 that kind of came out of this game with very low fantasy points, right? Or lower than potentially expected, I guess I should say. So Troy Franklin had 1.9 fantasy points. He only had 2 targets. I mean, really nice deep ball again that he could not come down with. He's got to start making those catches. The drop touchdown in week 5. Could have had a nice fantasy stat line there. Could have had at least a better fantasy stat line in week 8, but also the game script didn't really benefit him. So this is just me making excuses for those of you who started Troy Franklin as a kind of risky high upside or desperation flex play this past week. But he actually probably has a nice chance to bounce back against this Ravens secondary that just got torched by Sid Tillman, Jerry Jeudy, and Elijah Moore, but I don't know if I want to risk it in my starting lineup. Then we got Devon Vele as well, who had 5.8 fantasy points this week, 3 targets, 3 catches, 28 receiving yards, and he probably has a nice opportunity in this game as well. He has 2 double-digit fantasy performances on the season, but yeah, I'm just not finding out in my starting lineup. Then we got the Ravens wide receivers who do have a very bad matchup this week. It is a tough matchup anytime you have a wide receiver 1 going up against Pat Surtain, who I think is the best corner in the league. But I feel like Zay Flowers is just hard to bench. I mean, most of the season we have said bench wide receiver 1s against Pat Surtain, but the way that Zay Flowers gets kind of moved around the field and the way he's utilized, I could see him still being a good lower ceiling start this week, but proceed with caution if you own Zay Flowers, who did bounce back this past week with 18.5 fantasy points. Then we got Rashad Bateman, another guy who I thought was a nice sneaky start against the Browns. Good matchup. It was a good game script. We've talked a lot about Rashad Bateman in the past couple weeks, including going into week 7, where I told you guys I really liked him when he had ended up with 22.1 fantasy points against the Bucs, but came back to earth this past week. Very disappointing, but I still think he's kind of in that volatile flex area. But it's also a tough matchup, so for the most part, I'm probably going to sit him. Then Nelson Aguilar had, his monthly or bi-monthly touchdown or yearly touchdown, whatever we want to call it, 12.6 fantasy points, but we're not trusting Nelson Aguilar moving into this week 9 matchup. So we'll see what happens. This should be an interesting game overall as we get into week 9. And we got the Bears traveling to face the Cardinals, and the Bears coming off a tough loss against the Washington Commanders that also included a bit of a down day for the second game in a row for DJ Moore. 5.4 fantasy points, 4 targets, 2 receptions, 27 receiving yards. And I'm okay starting DJ Moore this week. I think you got to keep the faith here in a good matchup against the Cardinals. I know the Cardinals defense looked a little bit better the past 2 weeks, especially against the Chargers, and maybe held up a little bit more than some people were anticipating against the Dolphins this past week. But I'm still going to start DJ Moore if I own him. Maybe he's kind of downgraded to like your flex area or whatever, but he should be a solid start this week in what should be an important game for both the Bears and the Cardinals. So we should get a good game script here. So I'm not going to overreact here. DJ Moore still has double-digit fantasy points in every game on the season except for the last 2 games. But I think the most concerning thing there is that these were both 2 good matchups in a row that he didn't produce in. So Keenan Allen also did not produce much of anything against the Commanders. 7 targets, 2 catches, 39 receiving yards. Did have that pass interference call against him in the red zone that maybe would have turned into a touchdown. Sure, it looked like it could have, but I still think he's in the flex area. He just holds a lot of risk. And Rome Odunze, 8.4 fantasy points, 6 targets, 3 catches, 41 receiving yards. I mean, this is just one of those wide receiver rooms where Keenan Allen and Rome Odunze are flex worthy each and every week, but they're very volatile. They don't hold a crazy high ceiling. But if you don't have better options, you can start them as long as it's a good matchup. And this is a good matchup on paper against the Cardinals. So we'll see what happens with the Bears wide receivers moving into the week. Marvin Harrison Jr., I was concerned, I will say, but he bounced back in big fashion. Like we mentioned earlier in the video, the Dolphins came into this past week with the best pass defense in the NFL, and it just did not matter. Marvin Harrison Jr. came through with 7 catches, 6 receptions, 111 receiving yards, 8 touchdowns, 23.1 fantasy points, his first double-digit performance since week 4 of the season. So keep him in your starting lineups. It's a tough matchup, don't get me wrong, against the Bears. But I'm going to continue to roll with Marvin Harrison Jr. if I own him. You're going to, just have to roll with the punches here, take the volatility with this offense and everything. But Marvin Harrison Jr. is still a top 20 wide receiver in fantasy football. Let's keep starting him. Michael Wilson at 14.1 fantasy points in week 8, 6 targets, 5 catches, a touchdown, 31 receiving yards. He's just been one of these players. You can flex him on a weekly basis, roll with the punches, take the volatility with this offense. He does have double-digit fantasy performances in half of the games so far on the season. It's just the weeks where he doesn't have double digits. Well, he doesn't do much of anything. So he's flex worthy, but proceed with caution. Then we got Greg the Torch Door 2, had 1.9 fantasy points in week 8 and really just has not been fantasy relevant whatsoever on the season. So he's a sit moving into week 9. All right, moving along, we have the Jaguars. You're going to travel to face the Eagles. And this is a tough wide receiver room to look at when we look at the Jaguars. Okay, Christian Kirk is out for the season. He needs to have surgery. He has broke his collarbone. Sad day for Christian Kirk owners, but he wasn't really looking so great the past couple of weeks anyways, but that's my guy, Christian Kirk. Anyways, Brian Thomas Jr., the bigger issue here at this point, he's dealing with a chest injury. It's considered day-to-day. I've seen conflicting reports on this injury, so don't really know what's going to happen with B-Tom going into week 9, but you guys know my thesis on Brian Thomas Jr. all year long has been start Brian Thomas Jr. no matter what. As long as he's healthy, this is a good matchup against the Eagles, who their defense has looked better as of late, but they did get torched by Jamar Chase this past week, so I'm not worried about it. So if he's healthy, he's a top 5 wide receiver in fantasy football. We have to start him on a weekly basis. Now, Gabe Davis also injured last week, but we weren't really considering him a start anyways, but he's dealing with a shoulder injury. And then we got Parker Washington as the next man up here, who had 4 targets, 3 catches, 46 receiving yards, and 7.6 fantasy points in week 8. I mean, desperation flex play at best if you want to take a look at Parker Washington, but I'm just going to sit him. I don't want to risk it. Then you got Tim Jones, 2 targets, 1 catch, 3 receiving yards. Yeah, I'm staying away from anybody here except for a healthy Brian Thomas Jr. And please, fantasy gods, let Brian Thomas Jr. be healthy. All right. Looking at the Eagles wide receivers, we start them every single week, no matter what. A.J. Brown, 13.4 fantasy points in week 8, 6 targets, 5 catches, 84 receiving yards. He has 13.4 or more fantasy points in every game this year. No reason to sit him against the Jacksonville Jaguars. He is in a smash spot in this matchup. Then Devonta Smith, my top buy low option going into week 8 after having 0.8 fantasy points in week 7. I told you guys, this is part of the Devonta Smith experience. He has a goose egg game every year, literally. And he bounced back with 20.5 fantasy points, 7 targets, 6 catches, 85 receiving yards, a touchdown, and he has a fantastic matchup against the Jags this week. We are starting both these Eagles wide receivers no matter what, but especially against the Jags here in week 9. Next up, we have the Rams traveling to face the Seahawks. This should be a fun one. We got that Seahawks defense not looking good, and we got that Rams offense. looking good with Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua both back. They are both going to be starts no matter what, as long as they are healthy. Puka Nacua, 18.1 fantasy points in a game where he was supposed to be limited. 9 targets, 7 catches, 106 receiving yards. Cooper Kupp, he's washed. He's old. He's coming off. And no. 8 targets, 5 catches, 51 receiving yards, 8 touchdowns, 16.1 fantasy points against this depleted Seahawks defense that just got torched by the Bills. Yeah, we're starting both of them. Now, I think Demarcus Robinson is okay as a flex. 2 catches last week, 2 touchdowns, 17.5 fantasy points. I like Demarcus Robinson in an interesting way when Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua play, but he doesn't seem to be as good when those two are missing or one of them is missing. So I like Robinson. I think going into the season, he was supposed to be the wide receiver 3 on this depth chart, but proceed with caution. I think he's a good flex. He sits at 15% rostered, so a guy to keep an eye on. In terms of everybody else, Tutu Atwell, 2.8 fantasy points in week 8. Then we got Tyler Johnson on this team as well, who did next to nothing, 1.6 fantasy points in week 8. And then we got Jordan Whittington, who missed week 7 and 8, and so far on the week has not been practicing. So keep an eye on him. I still like Whittington. If he comes back into the mix, he could certainly have a role, but let's just consider him a sit until we know he's fully healthy. Speaking of fully healthy, DK Metcalf, there's optimism he can play in week 9. If he does, it's a good matchup. There's also the chance that he does not play while dealing with that knee injury. So we'll see what happens with Metcalf. We'll have to follow the reports as the week goes on. But of course, if DK Metcalf starts, you play him. Got hurt in week 7, but still had 19.9 fantasy points and a touchdown off of 4 catches and then missed this past week dealing with the knee injury. So got to keep an eye on DK Metcalf moving forward. And then, I know JSN was disappointing this past week, but he still had 12.9 fantasy points. And I know Tyler Lockett had his worst game of the season with 1.9 fantasy points, but these guys are always flex worthy. Tons of volatility. I mean, I know it's been an easy answer, but all season long with the Seahawks wide receivers, I've said, start DK Metcalf. And if you want to risk flexing JSN or Tyler Lockett, that's okay. And that's still how I feel going into week 9. Next up, we have the Lions traveling to face the Packers in what should hopefully be a big divisional matchup, but the health of Jordan Love is going to make this one interesting. But let's start with the Lions. You start Amon-Ra St. Brown every single week. I mean, 2 catches this past week, a touchdown, 8.7 fantasy points. That's not what you want out of Amon-Ra St. Brown, who was top 10 draft pick, top 5 draft pick, depending on your league. And just don't worry about it. This offense is just so good. This team is doing so many things well that we're going to see a little bit of volatility here. But he is a top 10 wide receiver in fantasy scoring right now. Don't overthink it. We're not benching Amon-Ra St. Brown against Jaire Alexander. This Packers secondary has still been good. You might look at the matchup and say, don't do it. Start Amon-Ra St. Brown, okay? Then we know Jameson Williams still suspended, so that leaves Khalif Raymond and Tim Patrick. And I'm just going to go ahead and say that I think Khalif Raymond is an okay flex. We've talked in the last 2-ish weeks. I keep an eye on Khalif Raymond, Tim Patrick. We've seen them do some stuff. And that was before the Jameson Williams suspension. And Raymond quietly has 11.3 or more fantasy points in his last 3 games and 2 touchdowns in his last 3 games as well. So sure, fire him up. This is an important matchup against the Packers. Big divisional matchup overall here. So, this is just the second divisional matchup for the Lions. So, yeah, Khalif Raymond's 2% rostered. There's certainly risk here, but I think he could be a solid flex option this week. Tim Patrick, he's getting involved mainly as a blocker, but he has seen some involvement, but not so much in week 8 with just 1 target, 0 catches. So I'm going to sit him, but yeah, there's some opportunity opening up here in an offense that is doing all kinds of things right. Now, Packers, Jordan Love, what are we going to do? He's dealing with a strained groin, He is day-to-day to open the week, so I think there is going to be a push for Jordan Love to play because this is a divisional matchup. But at the same time, the Packers have a week 10 bye, and they could certainly rest him, but the next time these two play, it's at Detroit in week 14. This is a big divisional game, so I think they're certainly going to push for Jordan Love to play, but we'll have to see what happens. And The other kind of thesis here is that they won 2 games with Malik Willis at the starting quarterback position, but that was against the Colts and the Titans, and this is against probably the best team in the NFL right now. So, listen, Jaden Reed, Romeo Doubs, Christian Watson, Dontavion Wicks. We got plenty of options here. They're all worth starting, arguably, right? We're still at that point where you can make an argument to start any of these guys, but at the end of the day, it all depends on Jordan Love's health. And at that point, what type of ceiling do we get out of these players if he does not start? So if Love starts, Reed, Dobbs are the guys I prefer. But of course, Wicks and Watson can always pop off. Watson, 7.9 fantasy points in week 8. Wicks had 3.1. Romeo Doubs, 10.2. Jaden Reed, 7.5. So not looking at super high ceilings as of late, but should be a competitive matchup. We're just going to have to see what happens with Jordan Love as the week progresses. If he plays, Reed, Dobbs, good starts, I think. Watson, Wicks, very, very, very volatile, risky flex plays. If Jordan Love does not play this week, then I'm probably staying away from the Packers wide receivers in this matchup. Next up, we got the Colts traveling to face the Vikings. And boy, oh boy, what do we do with the Colts wide receivers? The first thing I'll say is that the Colts have not committed to Anthony Richardson starting at the quarterback position this week. According to their head coach, they will be evaluating everything. So if Joe Flacco gets to start this week, then we can start Michael Pittman and Josh Downs. They're probably still in that flex area. I mean, you've probably gotten used at this point in the season to having other guys step up, right? So this is really going to depend. If Anthony Richardson's the quarterback, I still think you can flex Pittman and Downs, but you got to roll with the punches. I mean, Downs, 1.3 fantasy points in week 7, 22.2 in week 8. Pittman, 9.3 in week 7, 2.6 in week 8. So it's just all over the place here. I understand if you just want to flat out bench these guys, but it is a good matchup. And if Flacco plays, then we have to elevate them to the start area, even if you're just starting them in the flex. Alec Pierce can't do it, 2.1 fantasy points. The consistency has just not been there. Then we got A.D. Mitchell as well, 1.9 fantasy points in week 8. Just no thank you. But we're really going to have to see what happens with the Joe Flacco, Anthony Richardson situation. All right. Justin Jefferson, on the other hand, is your wide receiver 2 in fantasy football. 19.5 fantasy points in week 8, 9 targets, 8 catches, 115 receiving yards. Don't think twice about it. Start JJ no matter what. Now, Jordan Addison, maybe not fair to put him in the start category, but I'm giving Addison one last chance. He should probably realistically be in the flex category, and some of you guys definitely will argue he should be in the sit category. I'm giving him one last chance. I like the potential for this matchup overall. So if you own Addison, sure, low-end flex, nah. The more I talk about this, should probably just be a flex option this week, but for some reason I left him as a start. So I still have faith in Jordan Addison. I really do. I believed in him in week 8, He only had 4.2 fantasy points, though. 3 targets, 2 catches, 22 receiving yards. But I really believe with this passing attack and the Vikings coming off of 2 straight losses that they got to get it going, and this could be a good week for Jordan Addison. Jalen Naylor, on the other hand, we just have not seen much of anything. I know he had a decent week against the Lions, but really, since Addison's come back, we've seen next to nothing out of Jalen Naylor, So he's going to be a sit moving into week 9. All right, last but not least, we have the Bucs traveling to face the Chiefs. And yeah, I think I'm just sitting the Buccaneers wide receivers. This is just a bad matchup on the road. Cade Otton's going to benefit with Mike Evans out and Godwin out for the year. Rachaad White's going to benefit. We saw Bucky Irving have 7 catches. He benefited. And I think McMillan is still an okay flex. He had the most target share last week. We know Shepard got hurt. He should have an asterisk next to his name. Sorry, he's dealing with that hamstring injury. And then Trey Palmer did nothing. McMillan's the most startable player here, but it's a bad matchup. I just don't like it. I just don't think you should be in a position where you have to start Jalen McMillan or any Tampa Bay Buccaneers wide receiver. So just don't do it. I just don't want to start any of these guys. Cade Otton, Rachaad White, Bucky Irving, those are the players that I'm looking at right now for the Bucs. But if I was forced to start a wide receiver for the Bucs right now, it would be Jalen McMillan. All right. The Chiefs, on the other hand, I liked Xavier Worthy going into this past week. It just felt like a good spot for him. But just 8 targets, 4 catches, 37 receiving yards. But he did score a touchdown and have 13.7 fantasy points. But the main reason he's back in the flex this week is because this is a great matchup against the Bucs. The secondary has struggled. Overall, this team has struggled against wide receivers on the season. This defense looks bad. So I would start Xavier Worthy this week in the flex. He's a player who has some volatility and some risk, but some nice upside as well. And I wasn't crazy about D-Hop last week. Thought he was startable. And you just never know what you're going to get with a wide receiver on a new team right after the trade. And 3 targets, 2 catches, 29 receiving yards. Did have a nice catch in this game, but just 4.9 fantasy points. He's in the flex category this week, though, for the same reason as Xavier Worthy, because this is a good matchup overall against the Buccaneers this week. So I'll go ahead and leave Hopkins in the flex area, but he's not much more than that. Excuse me. All right. McCole Hardman's a sit. He had 1.8 fantasy points this past week. Justin Watson is a sit. He had 6.3 fantasy points this past week. So see what happens here, but unfortunately not the best overall matchup for the wide receiver position here in week 9. I'll do it for today's video. There's every single matchup, every single wide receiver, and who you should be starting, sitting, or flexing as we move into the week. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comment section down below. If you guys need anything whatsoever as we approach week 9, drop me a comment. I'll answer every single comment on this video before Thursday Night Football and before Sunday's slate of games. And don't forget, guys, as the week goes on, we're going to have every single thing you could possibly need here on the channel to help you dominate week 9 of 2024 fantasy football. So make sure you guys are checking out all of the videos, but more importantly, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the content. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.